Welcome back to the British Chronicle, your window into Britain's stories, memories, and timeless moments. If you enjoy this journey, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you'll never miss a new story. In post-war Britain, stepping into a supermarket was stepping into a new era of convenience and community. Warm light, narrow aisles, and trolleys that clattered across tiled floors marked the shift from the corner grocer to modern rituals of the weekly shop. These were more than stores. They threaded themselves into family life. Cart rides became small adventures. Bargains felt triumphant, and every shopper carried a sliver of pride home in the basket. The names on the glass, Fine Fare, the Co-op, Gateway, Sainsbury's, were not just brands, but new civic squares, where the bustle of a changed country could be heard in the rattle of tins and the hum of chest freezers. Fine Fare was one of the first to make that promise feel modern. Its bold yellow and black signage announced a no-nonsense value that working families could trust. Inside, stores were modest but well-ordered. Tiled floors, stacked tins, the pleasant drone of freezers. In the early 1980s, Fine Fare's bright yellow pack budget range, plain wrappers, rock-bottom prices, turned frugality into a point of pride for millions. It was the country's first basic own-label line, a small revolution wrapped in mustard yellow. The chain itself would not survive the decade. Sold to the D Corporation in 1986 and rebadged as Gateway, the Fine Fare name faded by 1988. Yet the memory remains vivid, as if the brand's high-contrast palette left a permanent after-image on the nation's high streets. If Fine Fare promised modern efficiency, the cooperative movement offered something older and deeper: the feeling that your groceries belonged, in part, to you. The DVI turned receipts into membership and membership into a share of the year's profits. Families could recite their dividend numbers as easily as their phone numbers. Shopping here felt circular, money returning to the community that spent it, values stocked next to bread and margarine. Even as self-service replaced the old counters and white coat clerks, the ritual of the dividend anchored the weekly shop in a sense of place. By the 1960s, self-service had hardened into the new normal. The choreography changed. No more asking at the counter for sugar or tea. Now we moved along the shelves, choosing for ourselves. Sainsbury's had set the template as early as 1950 in Croydon, with bright aisles where goods were picked straight from the display. The last of its counter service branches closed in 1982. The stagecraft of retail, tiles, scales, glass, gave way to barcodes, baskets, and the clean geometry of shelves. We did not simply buy differently. We learned to look differently, scanning labels for weight and price per ounce, comparing not only brands but the futures they seemed to promise. Gateway gathered momentum as the decade turned, promising a bigger, brighter weekly shop. Wide aisles, full-size trolleys, strip lighting that made everything feel a little more grown-up. For many families, it was the first time the shop felt like the supermarket on television. Efficient, anonymous, and somehow hopeful. Later, Gateway would morph into Summerfield and, in time, be absorbed again, the way so many familiar names were folded into larger empires. The signs came down, but the habits remained. Looking back now, the supermarkets of that era feel like photographs you can still step into. Steam lifting from bakery ovens, the chill breath of freezer aisles, quiet greetings exchanged near the potatoes in the window light. They were places where post-war frugality met modern choice, where a nation learned to shop itself into the future. And yet the question lingers in the fluorescent hush of memory. How could something so big disappear so completely? Across Britain's high streets, another banner once drew shoppers in: Presto. Its dark blue and orange livery spoke of quiet assurance, a northern solidity that felt both homely and progressive. Presto's slogan, "You'll be impressed with Presto," was more than a rhyme. It was a promise to families who needed variety without losing sight of price. Inside, produce gleamed beneath fluorescent light, while tins and packets stood in neat, unfussy rows. Unlike the glamour of London's department stores, Presto felt anchored in its towns, practical, respectful of pay packets, yet proud of modern service. For a time, its stores became the dependable heart of the weekly shop, a halfway point between the corner shop's gossip and the emerging slickness of national chains. By the 1990s, however, Presto's branches were folded into Safeway, another casualty of a market where scale was everything and loyalty rarely survived the next acquisition. Long before Presto, Lipton supermarkets tried to parlay their famous tea into a broader shopping revolution. They were brief, a flash of optimism in the 1960s, when Britain's retail landscape was still negotiating its own future. Lipton's clean signage and polished floors offered shoppers a vision of domestic modernity. There was a whiff of novelty in the tiled vestibules, a sense that food shopping could be as orderly as a catalog page. Even if the experiment didn't last, absorbed or renamed by the late 70s, it gave families a first taste of a brighter, more choreographed way to buy their groceries. The sort of excursion that children remembered for the smell of oranges and the click of polished doors. Meanwhile, a chain with a different sort of daring was preparing Britain for the freezer age. Bajam, founded in the 1960s by the Brierley family, was the country's first dedicated frozen food specialist. Walking into one of its shops was like stepping a little way into the future. Rows of chest freezers, white tiles gleaming, the constant breath of cold air. For households just buying their first fridge freezer, Bajam was a marvel. Oven chips, peas, fish fingers, all lined up waiting to be stored for another day. Frozen food altered the rhythm of domestic life, letting families plan a week of meals rather than dash daily to the grocer. When Bajam was taken over by Iceland in the late 1980s, its name slipped quietly into history, but a generation still recalls that sense of novelty, the hum of cooling units that promised freedom from the tyranny of the daily shop. Further back still, there was a quieter presence, international stores, whose origins stretched into the 19th century. These shops carried the calm sobriety of rationing years. Orderly shelves, red and cream signage, a layout that reminded customers not to waste. International's legacy belonged to a Britain still scarred by shortages, when sugar and flour were measured carefully, and every item bought was a small victory over austerity. By the 1980s, newer players with brighter lighting and bigger car parks had left it behind. Yet its very plainness is what gives the name its strange dignity today. It stood for thrift and dependability, and for a time that was enough. All of these stores, whether bold experiments or steady fixtures, trace the rise of a culture learning how to feed itself in an age of affluence. They mark the point where necessity and novelty collided, when price, choice, and pride were stacked side by side on wooden pallets and metal shelving. Their names are gone from signboards, but linger in memory, whispering of Saturdays spent wandering fluorescent aisles and the satisfaction of a well-filled basket. How could a landscape so full of bustle leave behind such a stillness? For shoppers in crowded estates and inner-city streets, another sign once offered its own brand of reassurance. Victor Value. Bright, almost gaudy lettering drew you in from the pavement, a promise that the week's essentials could be had without drama or debt. Inside, the stores were tight but lively. Stacked cereals forming little walls, loose apples tumbling gently in wooden crates, queues shuffling toward plain counters. There was no time for frills. Parents with children in tow prized Victor Value for its quick pace and prices written boldly on card. In the 1960s, when wages stretched only so far, that no-nonsense ethos felt like fairness. Tesco would later absorb the chain, yet its memory endures as a reminder that thrift could be a badge of pride rather than a mark of hardship. Then there was Main Stop, sometimes spelled Main Top in local lore, an ambitious experiment of the early 1980s. Backed by British American Tobacco, these stores tried to make the weekly shop look sleek and aspirational. Polished shelving, bold signage, a sense that supermarkets could be as carefully designed as a boutique. They promised a new type of shopping, modern without arrogance, stylish without pushing prices beyond reach. But timing is an unforgiving partner. Main Stop arrived in a retail world already consolidating around bigger names, and its brief blaze was over almost as soon as it began. By the mid-decade, its doors had closed, leaving only a few photographs and recollections of a supermarket that dared to suggest grocery buying could be glamorous. Beyond these upstarts, one stalwart was quietly building a legend. Sainsbury's, long before its orange logo became ubiquitous, had a very different feel. Step inside an early branch and you might have thought you'd entered a grocer's parlor. Tiled walls, counters polished to a shine, white apron staff slicing ham or weighing flour behind glass. There was a warmth to the service, a sense that each transaction was also a brief conversation. The shift to self-service during the 1950s and 60s was slow, almost reluctant, reflecting a Britain that prized familiarity even while reaching for efficiency. By the 1970s, Sainsbury's had embraced the new style entirely, but traces of that older, almost ceremonial atmosphere clung to its reputation, proof that speed and scale did not have to erase character. Taken together, these names form a mosaic of post-Usapilmatsi, Saitan Amoyus, War Britain's appetite for change. They speak of a society trying to balance thrift and novelty, service and speed, community and choice. In their different ways, they taught families how to shop in a world where abundance was finally possible, but still needed careful stewardship. Walking their aisles was to witness an economy in miniature, supply chains humming behind the tins of peaches, shipping routes traced in sacks of flour, price tags reflecting not only cost, but a nation's confidence in its own prosperity. And yet, as the decades turned, mergers and rebrandings swept away their individuality, leaving behind only faint echoes, like the smell of fresh bread when the shop itself is long since boarded up. How did a chorus of so many familiar voices fall silent so completely? By the late 20th century, Britain's supermarket map had become a living chart of ambition, caution, and changing habits. In market towns and suburbs alike, these stores were not just places of purchase, but quiet stages where the nation rehearsed a new identity. Fine Fare's plain economy packs, Victor Value's quick-fire efficiency, Presto's northern poise. Each chain taught customers something about how to manage choice, how to stretch a wage packet, how to see themselves reflected in shelves of tea and tins. Even as ownerships shifted and head offices merged, the storefronts held steady, reassuring against the anxieties of inflation or redundancy. They were the modest, fluorescent guardians of an everyday plenty that Britain, still remembering ration books, did not take for granted. Economics, too, was written in their price tags. The rise of own label lines mirrored the era's industrial pragmatism, when nationalized industries gave way to freer markets and a chorus of competing suppliers. By the 1970s, logistics, pallets, barcodes, chilled vans, became as crucial as the goods themselves. Retailers invested in regional distribution hubs, shrinking the gap between farms, factories, and the checkout counter. That quiet revolution meant tinned soup and soft rolls could arrive with clockwork predictability, a comfort to families adjusting to the turbulence of oil crises, wage disputes, and shifting trade rules. Supermarkets were no longer quaint grocers. They were nodes in a growing web of food security and consumer expectation. Yet for all their modernity, these shops still bore the texture of their communities. In a Sainsbury's, you might meet a neighbor debating the best cut of bacon. At the co-op, dividends were tallied with the same care given to the week's budget. Even Belgium, with its clinical freezers, offered a thrill that was social as well as culinary. Frozen peas or an ice cream. Brick became tokens of progress, bragged about over garden fences. Shopping was an act woven into memory. Mothers shepherding children past biscuit shelves, couples weighing a splurge on fresh coffee, students filling baskets before a first flat supper. As the 1980s advanced, competition sharpened. The arrival of continental discounters and the muscle of giants like Tesco and Asda began to squeeze out mid-sized rivals. Chains such as Mainstop, Victor Value, and international stores lacked the capital to modernize at speed or match the reach of sprawling out-of-town developments. Some, like Gateway, tried reinvention, Summerfield, then part of a larger web of takeovers, but many were quietly absorbed or shuttered, their old liveries fading under new paint. The nation, meanwhile, became used to fewer names but larger footprints, megastores with wide car parks and ever longer opening hours. Looking back, the quiet attrition of those earlier brands feels almost stealthy. There were no grand farewells, no last rites read over the tiled aisles where people had chosen their tea or bread for years. One week a sign promised value. The next, it was gone, replaced by a different shade, a different slogan. The change was pragmatic, but it also thinned something invisible. A network of modest landmarks that once told shoppers they belonged, that even in the rush of commerce, there was room for recognition. How, we might ask, did we let so many of those gentle anchors slip from our streets and our lives? By the dawn of the 1990s, the supermarket story had become one of scale and relentless efficiency. Consolidation was no longer an exception, but the rule. Fine Fare subsumed by Gateway, Gateway reborn as Summerfield, Presto folded into Safeway, Bejam rebranded under Iceland's red banner. Even the co-op, that patient steward of working-class dividends, was trimming and merging its far-flung societies to stand against the sheer horsepower of Tesco and Sainsbury's. For shoppers, these changes were often invisible at first. The same aisles, the same hum of refrigeration, until one day a familiar sign vanished and a new logo gleamed where an old one had weathered rain and sun. The reasons lay beyond the shopping basket. Britain was retuning its economy after decades of upheaval. European trade agreements reshaped supply lines, and computerized inventory meant stock could be ordered from a terminal rather than a telephone. Out-of-town hypermarkets promised acres of parking and prices shaved by bulk buying, and policymakers quietly welcomed the investment such giants could bring. But in the shadows of these grand designs, high streets lost something subtler: the rhythm of local shops where staff knew a child's favorite biscuit, or where Saturday morning queues stitched neighbors together in the ordinary choreography of waiting. For many who grew up with the old names, memory is textured not by data but by sense and sound. They remember the waxy feel of yellow pack margarine at Fine Fare, the brisk clack of metal tills in a Victor Value, or the little slip of paper recording a co-op dividend number. They picture the cool mist above Bejam's chest freezers, or the orange glow spilling from a Presto doorway on a winter afternoon. These recollections are not grand histories, yet they speak to the quiet ways prosperity settled into everyday life, promising that abundance could be simple, affordable, and shared. Some of the survivors adapted by widening their ambitions. Sainsbury's shifted from modest counter service to gleaming aisles, later building superstores that anchored new retail parks. Tesco learned to grow without losing its bargain hunter's edge, pushing into express formats as well as cavernous warehouses. Others, though, could not keep pace. International stores, once a post-war stalwart, withered as shoppers sought brighter interiors and deeper shelves. Mainstop's polished dream faded against the brute arithmetic of rent and distribution. And yet, amid the triumph of scale, there lingers a question about cost, not of bread or tea, but of memory. What happens when the sign above the door changes faster than a community can form around it? When every branch becomes an interchangeable node scrubbed of the stories that once clung to their walls? The efficiencies that built modern retail also pared away the familiar roughness that had made even a quick trip for milk feel part of a shared history. How could we have gained so much convenience and lost so much character without quite noticing? Today, only fragments remain of that once crowded landscape of names. A few co-ops still trade on their heritage, reminding older shoppers of dividend books and brown paper bags. Sainsbury's towers over retail parks, its logo burnished by decades of survival. But Fine Fare, Presto, Bejam, Victor Value, Mainstop, international stores, they survive mostly as stories pressed like old receipts between the pages of memory. Walk down a high street that has outlived its small grocers and you may catch a shadow. A faint outline where a sign once hung, a bricked-over service hatch, or an echo of trolleys clattering across tiles. The supermarkets that taught Britain how to shop have slipped into the same half-light as the milkman and the rag-and-bone cart. Yet their disappearance tells us more than a tale of lost brands. It is the story of how Britain itself shifted from post-war restraint to globalized abundance, from local bargains to international supply chains. Each merger, each boarded window, traced a larger curve. The rise of logistics empires, deregulated finance, continental imports, the quiet march of technology mapping every tin of beans. They remind us that even the most domestic rituals, buying bread, scanning for offers, standing in line, belong to a wider history of work, wages, and the politics of daily life. Still, the affection these stores inspire is not just nostalgia for old packaging or tiled floors. It is for the communities that gathered in their aisles, neighbors swapping news by the potatoes, staff who knew a child's name, pensioners resting for a moment by the counter. They were modest places, but they lent shape to ordinary weeks, anchoring lives with the simple promise that food would be there, choice would be there, and some small dignity would be there too. When we recall the scent of fresh bread from a fine fair oven, or the gleam of Bajam's frozen cabinets, we are not only remembering shops, we are tracing the contours of a society that built meaning from its marketplaces. To preserve those echoes is to honor a Britain that believed in shared prosperity, in careful spending, and in the pleasure of something as plain as filling a basket. And so, as the fluorescent hum fades and the shelves of memory grow thin, one question remains, steady as a price tag in an empty aisle. How could something so essential, so woven into the fabric of home, vanish so completely? And what does its absence tell us about the way we live now?